Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sunder, Director of British Future. Welcome to this webinar today, Teaching Modern Britain. How can the curriculum include us all? This is one of a pair of events that British Future's holding about the future policy event on race that we could adopt now. We had the publication earlier this spring of the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. It led to a large public debate, but rather a heated and polarized one in many ways. And what we felt didn't really happen in that debate at first was a debate about the different policy themes that the Commission was proposing, that other people were critiquing. And so what we're trying to do today is have a debate about one of these policy themes. We recently had one on policing as well, which is the idea of an inclusive curriculum and what needs to change to do that. So the idea of the event is, among our panel, among the audience, we're going to have different views, critical views, supportive views of what the Commission has said. I think hopefully we'll show that you can have a constructive disagreement, maybe find some points of agreement and common ground as well. And the theme that we're talking about, how can the curriculum include us all, is I think a really good example of an issue on which we could have a very polarizing debate, as to some extent we've had about the public realm, statues, what should come up, what should come down, or hopefully a more bridging debate about what happens in our classrooms, what do we want to see reflected on the curriculum. So that's the theme for our panelists today. We've got Dr. Maggie Aderin-Pocock, who was a member of the Commission, Dr. Samir Puri, who's written great books, not just about the history of the British Empire, but all of the empires, practically. Patrick Vernon, who has been a commentator, a writer, an author on these issues for many years, who I've learned a lot from. David Aaronovitch, one of our leading columnists with the Times newspaper. So Maggie, I'd like you to start the discussion. Tell us what an inclusive curriculum means to you and what you'd like to see change. And you're muted, Maggie.
Step one, unmute. Thank you. Thank you, Sunder. And thank you also to British Futures for organising this event today. So as a member of the Independent Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, I think we took on a pretty monumental task, because it was an examination of disparities that still exist in the UK to come, UK today. I think many of us would agree we've come a long way, but there are still disparities. And we wanted to sort of take on those disparities and get an understanding of them. So to do this, we did sort of a detailed study of sort of the data available, and also looked at previous reports. We wanted to sort of build on the shoulders of giants. We wanted to see what had gone on before. So that was a good place to start. As well as that, we engaged with a number of different experts within the field to get their understanding and their viewpoint. And we also, which was my favorite bit, we engaged with the public. So spoke to many, many different people from sort of different walks of life to talk about their experiences of being a member of an ethnic minority here in the UK. So from the report, we produced 24 recommendations, and we want these recommendations to be taken on by the government, by public bodies, and also by the private sector. We're hoping that the recommendations will be a roadmap to make the UK a fairer place. Now, under our recommendations, the 24 recommendations, we actually grouped them into 4 different themes. These themes were sort of building trust between different communities and the institutions that serve them, promoting greater fairness to improve opportunities and outcomes for individuals and communities, sort of creating agencies so individuals can take greater control of the choices that impact their lives, and to achieve genuine inclusivity to ensure that all groups feel part of the UK society. Now, we're focusing today on the education section, and we made a number of findings, but the picture in education for different ethnic groups is quite a complex one. There are a number of different factors like sort of parental income, geography, attitudes or family attitudes towards education that all steer the educational outcomes of the kids of the UK. However, there were some themes that ran throughout, and strong early years sort of intervention and support for kids, and also good schools. It sort of makes sense, it's logical, but these things are good for everybody. One of the things we did find, and we kept on hitting our heads against really, was the acronym BAME. BAME is, I'm a scientist, so I see it as a black hole. It lumps lots of different ethnic minorities into a one homogeneous group. And to get an understanding of the complexities and the challenges faced by different communities, BAME just doesn't work. So we wanted sort of the aggregation of BAME, so we could look at different communities in their individual rights. But by looking at the evidence and actually breaking the acronym up, we did find that there are some in education, some amazing success stories that sort of go unreported. Kids, many different ethnic groups are doing much better than sort of the white British group. And so it's trying to understand why that's the case. So where the challenges are, what's causing them, and where the successes are, what's causing them too. So from the 24 recommendations, 5 were associated with education. And the first one is sort of building social and cultural capital. And this is sort of enrichment for all. And this is trying to extend the school day. This COVID is pushing us towards this anyway, but I think extending the school day makes a lot of sense, and especially in targeting sort of areas of sort of social deprivation. By extending the school day, we give kids the opportunity to do sort of a culturally enriching sort of things, music, sport, many things that we take for granted, but sort of make sure that they're available to everyone. The next recommendation was sort of replicating the factors of educational success. Many people sort of focus on sort of the challenging areas and what's going wrong, but where there is success, let's dive into it, let's understand it, let's replicate that across the board so all kids can benefit from sort of that blueprint that leads to kids having sort of successful educational outcomes. The next recommendation was better targeted funding. I'm a space scientist, so I feel I'm fairly okay with most of the maths, but diving into the way funding is allocated in schools sort of gave me a little bit of a headache, let's put it that way. But I think what we need to do is work out where the challenges are, work out where the disparities are, and make sure that funding gets funneled into the right place and for the right kids. The next recommendation was sort of, yes, open access to apprenticeships. Now, apprenticeships, I think, are one of the unsung heroes. Many schools seem to be focused on getting kids into university, but I myself was at one of my old companies the other day, filming for The Sky at Night, and we were talking about apprenticeships, and I was speaking to 2 apprentices, and they were saying that when they were at school, they never heard about apprenticeships. They didn't know that they were available. This is true and replicated across many, especially in ethnic minorities. So how can we sort of promote them? Because they can lead to some fantastic educational outcomes, but many people don't know about them. And the final recommendation in education is the making of modern Britain, what we're here to talk about today. And this is trying to come up with a curriculum, an online resource that talks about the multiple and nuanced stories of the contributions made by different ethnic groups to make the country what it is today. We want the Department of Education and a group of experts to team together to come up with a brilliant online resource that can be used in all schools. But we don't want it to be sort of a little body standalone on its own. We want it to be part of the school curriculum. I have an 11-year-old daughter, and a couple of years ago, she was learning about the Egyptians. But she didn't just learn about the Egyptians in history, she learned about them in mathematics, looking at how they sort of work things out. She learned about the Egyptians and made a pop-up book in DT. It's trying to make it part of the curriculum, not just sort of something that's sort of trotted out in Black History Month. So it's an inclusive curriculum, but it's also inclusive within the curriculum. So sort of engaging everybody and sort of part of our culture. And I think that is the point. Here in the UK, we have a rich and diverse culture made up of a mosaic of many different traditions. Each story is interesting in its own right, but when you weave the different strands together and look at the interaction between the different ethnic groups, you get a fantastic narrative. And so, and I think but by looking at this narrative, by understanding the past and how our different ethnic groups have come together in the UK, it fosters a sense of sort of a belonging, but it also gives us an understanding of where we're going in the future. And that's why I think that this recommendation is so important. And I'm looking forward to discussing it further with you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maggie, and that opens up with that the breadth of the themes on education coming into this question of the inclusive curriculum. Dr. Samir Puri, you're writer and author on this, and I know you've also researched and made a submission about how to do this. I mean, in principle, this sounds like the kind of thing we should all be able to agree that we want to do, but we have this cultural polarization right now about these themes of identity. Can we make practical progress, and how, while navigating those choppy waters?
Well, Sunder, first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of the panel. Just before I dive into that almost insoluble question that you've just presented, just to give a quick intro to the viewers. So I wasn't one of the authors of the Commission report, but I was very privileged to be able to submit evidence and views to the Commission on this particular specific theme of the making of modern Britain. How on earth do we approach the teaching of a subject which, of course, unlike the physics and natural sciences that Maggie is very familiar with, this is the realm of subjectivity. We don't have empirical data. We have different contending perspectives. Some of them are very emotionally, I guess, charged, not only for the children, but also for their parents. And some of the question you asked, I can sum up in the following way. I mean, I came to be asked by the Commission because I had happened to write a book called The Great Imperial Hangover, which is about how societies live with the evolving relationships they have with the empires that their forebears built maybe decades, maybe centuries ago. And you mentioned having a bridging debate at the start. The difficulty of polarization is that we all know it's not just a Twitterati, it has actually now come out onto a bit more mainstream consciousness. There is a constituency of people in Britain, to be very blunt, who wish to and feel perfectly justified in deriving a strong sense of pride from the accomplishments of the British Empire as it goes back through its nearly 5 centuries of existence. And there is also a very well organized and very impassioned group of people in Britain who are deeply offended by sometimes not even the implication that the British Empire has influenced the modern era, but its very existence. And there are a lot of, you can go to Waterstones now and you'll see books, arguing for and against this case. It's in a microcosm, something of a reflection of what's happened in politics, I think, in which there's a drift to the polls. And maybe it's because of Twitter enabling, very impassioned specific opinions. Now, here's the thing. When I wrote my submission to the Commission, providing some insight into where the curriculum could go, what I said was, you can't square this circle. In some respects, some of these positions are so entrenched, they're becoming even more entrenched. Actually, from my perspective, as someone who's written a book on this subject, some of it's down to the inheritance that we specifically received from our own forebears. I'm not saying that whether your parents were imperialists or whether your parents were subjugated by in the colonies, that you get automatic perspectives for and against. But I certainly know from my own perspective, my family from East Africa, originally from India, they were on the receiving end of British colonialism. And I got a certain set of stories at home about that. And later on in my career, I ended up sort of working with and being in environments where people were, I guess, more generally unquestionably proud about the diffusion of the English language, the Queen as a head of state for so many countries, all these other, and the bequeathing of democracy in that sort of the empire wasn't so bad argument. So what can we do? Just to wrap up my sort of quick opening comments in terms of moving forward. Well, if we can't square the circle, and I think it's not about making one argument beat the other one. That's the problem with the debate. Is I want my view of this subjective, complex event to win in the debate, and I don't think that's practical. Of course, just one other quick example. It's very fashionable now to say, well, The Germans have dealt with the Nazi era so responsibly and educated their children in a way that renounces militarism. Why can't we do the same? Well, I tell you, firstly, World War II was a 6-year event with a beginning, middle, and an end. The British Empire lasted for 5 centuries, and as a result, squashing it into a sort of a small formula that one can take a sort of more morally unambiguous position on is just a lot harder. And also, it wasn't a solely murderous entity, nor was it a benign diffuser of democracy. It was all these things mixed together. What do we do with our kids, though? So the first thing we need to do, this is my sort of wrapping up my sort of 5, 6, 7 minutes, is we are, I mean, I'm an older millennial, born in the early 80s, but of course the kids we're talking about are born now and in the next 5 years. We shouldn't be pushing our experiences and our views as older people onto another generation, nor should we be treating children as a blank slate, of course. What I think we should be doing is having a few non-negotiable sort of bedrock issues and stories and facts about Britain that we need to tell children as part of our civic duty to educate them. And I'll just give you 1 or 2 ideas before I hand over Sunder as to where I think I'd be going with this. I was amazed growing up, born in East London, grew up in West London, went to some state schools. My white British friends had no idea about the circumstances of the arrival of my forebears and the arrival of our black British classmates' forebears as well to Britain. They'd never heard of Windrush. They had frankly never even heard of the Commonwealth. They had no idea my parents were not immigrants, they're British subjects. All this stuff is basic. And I think, I would go back to basics, not about winning arguments, just basically educate people about these things because it's interesting, if nothing else. But you can also talk about the Commonwealth in relation to Canada, Australia, New Zealand. I don't think it's only an issue of minorities. I think it's an issue, the fact that large tracts and chunks of not only the British populace, but also its global personality have their roots in this vast experience of the British Empire, which has had great things happen around it, terrible things happen around it, and everything in between, depending on where you looked. And the final thing, my final comment is, thinking about polarization, thinking about the health of the British, population and its intellectual equipment, we want to be teaching children nuance and the ability to not have to feel that they have to go fully in one direction or the other. It's my way or the highway. And I can't think of, frankly, a more challenging, but also a more worthy subject through which to teach British children the skill and the art of nuance and of hearing other people out than this subject. And Sunder, I'll wrap up there. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Samir. I'm going to come on to Patrick next. It's interesting, Samir said that, in the classrooms of the 1980s, very few people would have heard of the Windrush. I mean, I was at school at Essex, not a million miles away from Tilbury, where the Windrush docked, and it was not mentioned. Now, Patrick, if many more people have heard of the Windrush now, there are lots of reasons for that, including the Windrush scandal, but actually the work you've done in civic society as an author over many years, and the campaign that you helped to forge for Windrush Day, which was eventually adopted by the government, was very important. So you've had a lot of experience of different generations of this debate, how got something onto the curriculum, and what do we now change in the 2020s. Love to hear your view about how we make progress in these very polarized times.
Yeah, well, thanks for inviting me on to today's event. And obviously I've worked close with Sunder for many years, particularly campaigning for Windrush Day and all the stuff around recognising the Commonwealth and the armed forces, which is all part of its history. Maggie, I just want to say, yes, I don't agree with all aspects of the report, but I think some of the recommendations that you've recognised are important. I think the issue I've got is about narrative. So if you look at a bit of a history lesson, the national curriculum was established in the 1980s by Kenneth Clark. And even then, when the national curriculum was first designed, which was on the basis of a so-called modern, working towards a modern Britain, lots of parent groups, lots of activists, teachers, all the trade said that the curriculum is still not inclusive. So we've spent the last 30, 40 years, believe it or not, trying to fight for an inclusive, modern curriculum. So I'm really glad that the Commission have acknowledged that aspect. What's important is that there've been a whole range of players trying to shape the curriculum. I've played my bit, and a lot of people have played their bits in shaping that curriculum. And the reasons why it feels like it's been an uphill battle to have an inclusive curriculum. And part of that problem is that politicians get involved in, like with NHS, telling trying to tell us what is in the curriculum. And that applies to all political parties. They've tried to shape the curriculum depending on what's the political flavour of the month or the ideology of the month, both left and right and centre. So we can have a debate about that. But the bottom line is when the curriculum's messed about, it misses out history, misses out, as Samir said, some basic facts which often is overridden and ignored. So I think there's opportunity in the context of Black Lives Matter and in the context of where we are in Britain today. I think COVID-19 has been a kick up the backside for all of us to remind us about the glaring inequalities in society and how we need to educate young people so they can tackle some of those big challenges in the future that we've probably left behind, the messed up climate change, for example. You know, they've got to sort that out now, haven't they? You know, so you know what I mean. So in the context of the debate for a inclusive curriculum, I've always argued that we should have more, not just simply more Black history in the curriculum, but more history of Southeast Asian communities, more history of Gypsy traveller communities. You know, making the history something which is important. I'm a member of the Royal Historical Society. We launched a report about 2 years ago looking at teaching of history in higher education. And what we found out in that report was a lot of, particularly Black children, didn't like history, and therefore the supply chain of having more Black history lecturers at university and teaching history is going to be less. Because the way that history is taught currently, on one level, dehumanizing, insulting, patronizing, and it's down to parents, supplementary schools, school projects, to make up that supplement. So the enrichment side is recognised. So we need to look at what do we need to do to make sure that there's an inclusive education. And that's been something that's been campaigned by a whole range of organisations, such as the NUT and the NEU, Bastard, the Black and Asian Societies, academic historians, everyone. We've all gotten there, left, right and centre. We're all trying to shape the curriculum. And then ever so often you might get concessions. So when I did my campaign some years ago, 100 Great Black Britons, did it 17 years ago, at that time, Mary Seacole was not in the national curriculum. Katwala was not in the national curriculum. Actually, you were more likely to learn more about Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement than Black British history. So things have changed since then. We all recognise that. And it's only just been recently that Windrush has now been included in the curriculum. So we're getting there, but more work needs to be done. And it's unfortunate that when you have a government minister castigating critical race theory to say that it's political ideology, she misses the point. The whole idea of critical race theory and all theories is it's analysis. It's not teaching children to do critical race theory, but it's about them having an understanding of the issue of race and the impact of race. And one of the key things that this country has failed to even get the head round is a history of enslavement. So when the report talks about that we've spent too much time talking about that and we should talk about that enslavement was character building for Black people, that is an insult. Where did that come? I know there's been change since then. That is a complete insult. If you understand the history of enslavement and the impact of enslavement, yeah, it's one of them. It's one of the most. It's recognised by the United Nations as a crime against humanity, which this country has not even signed up to yet. And I think it's really important that when we talk about this history, we talk about the full history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. But often we talk about the elements which is preferred. That let's talk about Wilberforce. We don't talk about Equiano. We don't talk about the Maroons. We don't talk about this whole history of struggle and resistance, which played a key part in that. You don't talk about. You even talk about the history of white people and activists who were also campaigning against slavery and enslavement as well. We need to have the full history so young people can look at that. And that's part of the problem with the curriculum. Unfortunately, sadly or not, the curriculum and education is now in the middle of this kind of cultural war. I hope that when England plays Germany tomorrow, it won't be such a cultural war, but you get my drift. But the key thing is it's been polarized, and yes, we need to have a proper debate. We need to have but let's work out having a curriculum that's reflective. I know that the recommendations are going to be chaired or implemented by the Duchy Lancaster, Michael Gove. Unfortunately, he didn't have much good form on Black history. I mean, he was the one that tried to get rid of Mary Seacole in 2013. And it was only a campaign working with OBV, working with the Mary Seacole Appeals Committee, Brennan Trust and others, that we stopped Michael Gove. Actually, it was actually intervention Nick Clegg, actually, to be fair. So I hope that Michael Gove learns that lesson of not to get rid of like Mary Seacole off the national curriculum, because I'm telling you, if he tries that again, he'll be dealing not with not Black women, but everyone in Britain. So just a message there. And I hope Maggie, you're going to be on our side on that too. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Patrick. I should mention to the audience, there's a Q&A function. A few of you have started to put your questions in, and I'll be taking questions for the panel if you could put them in the Q&A. So David, over to you. What are we trying to achieve here, and how do we take this forward?
Yeah, thank you. I'm the one total non-expert on this, but just taken a sort of, if you like, kind of lively interest over the years, and also as a Londoner who was not only educated in London in the Jurassic period myself, but also sent 3 kids through schools in what is, you know, just about one of the most diverse areas of the country. I just want to say this. When I was at William Ellis School in North London, there were 3 Black kids in the entire school out of 650 kids. There were many, many more Jewish children, including a fair number who'd come over from South Africa. Their parents were South African refugees, probably been part of the South African Communist Party, and so on. About a year and a half ago, before the pandemic, we took a class of William Ellis students, because the teacher there got in contact with me, to the Times. There were more children from the Congo in that group than there had been Black kids in school when I was there 40 years earlier, just from the Congo. Not children from empire, but actually refugee children, essentially, because we don't have that many empire imperial connections, this country, with Congo. I was reflecting upon what I was taught back then. I mean, one of the big problems we always have in educational discussion is that people always talk about how they were educated. So I'm not using this, if you like, as a kind of to say this is how the system always worked or worked. This is kind of a snapshot, because history was my subject and so on. And we talk about history a lot, but let's remember that most kids don't get taught history beyond the point where they go for GCSEs. So what you're talking about when you're talking about teaching history at school is what you're taught in primary schools and in Key Stage 3. Most people don't go beyond that. Essentially, all history at that point was the Whig version of history, what you call the Whig version of history, how Britain had built up from its kind of glorious features, you know, to the present point, which it was at to allow it to win World War II, and so on. That was essentially the scope of it. Let me give you an example of something that entirely misses out. One of the things it does, because this was just the history of England, by the way, in Scotland, you were taught an entirely different curriculum, so much so that Scottish kids don't know about Queen Elizabeth I. They don't, just as you don't know about King James I, 2nd, 3rd and 4th of Scotland. You don't know about it because you were never taught about it. So you weren't even taught about the United Kingdom up until the point that Britain essentially becomes a united monarchy under James I and a united country in 1707 under the Act of Union. You don't know about it. This is very important. The second thing is there were more school Jewish kids there. We were never taught about how Jewish people came to Britain at any point in our history classes, by the way, and we were never told that in 1290 England became the first country to expel the Jewish population. We were never told that. It doesn't appear in history, appeared nowhere in the school curriculum whatsoever. Nor would we have been taught the same curriculum about the Tudors if we'd been being taught in a Catholic school, because in an English school, Protestant school, you were taught the Reformation was a great thing, and Elizabeth I, get rid of the Pope and all that. In the Catholic schools, they were being taught about how Jesuits were martyred by the... So there were two actual versions of history being taught in different schools according to what denomination you were being taught. Then after that, you got into your A-level courses, your O-level courses, you started getting taught history in a kind of different way because you're already interested. So I took a look at the William Ellis site this week for what they're being taught in Key Stage 3, which is actually essentially what we're talking about. And we start off in year 7 with the William the Conqueror and medieval London, and how similar was the medieval Islamic world to medieval London. This is the point of comparison. But so quite early on, you're looking at a thing we never looked at, which is how to kind of try and make a comparison between a different civilization. In year 8, you get Industrial Revolution, how far does the Industrial Revolution deserve its name? And then British Empire, should Britain apologise for her empire? By the way, this is almost the only circumstance in which you get an idea that there is a question of apology or regret to be had in the context of history, which otherwise you are studying because it's history. And then in year 9, you get World War I, Hitler, Stalin, Holocaust, World War II, Cold War, and so on. Now, the first thing that you kind of think when you look about that is that there should actually be a history of migration in there. And actually probably should replace the First World War if it's going to replace any kind of aspect of that. In other words, there is no clarity or attempt to try and understand how Britons came to be Britons in the wider sense, etc. You understand how England developed into Britain and maybe how Britain's relation to the world, but you don't understand the components. Just as you didn't understand how Jews came to be in London, etc., through anything that we studied back then. Because by and large, the British approach towards teaching these things is, let's not talk about it. Let's not talk about it. Let's not discuss it. That's all a little bit awkward. Let's not discuss it. What we call the kind of polarization of debate that we have seen in a really tricky way during the course of the last few years, and particularly in the last few months, has made it even more difficult. I mean, to frame the whole question about poor white boys in terms of a discussion about white privilege just seemed to me to be a deliberate attempt to miss the point, when what we're talking about is classically groups' attitudes towards education, their investment in education and their social capital and so on. And we know that that differs significantly from group to group. And we also know why it is quite possible that groups of recent migrants have a significantly different attitude towards what a country and towards what an education system can offer. But here's a question I do want to ask of ourselves in this discussion. What is it exactly that we are trying to do here? Are we trying to get people to understand the world better? Or are we involved in some gigantic National Brotherhood Week, where, as you know, going on to Tom Lehrer's old song, National Brotherhood Week, get up and shake the hands of one anotherhood week, you know. Is the objective a kind of some kind of mutual love in terms of our education system, or is it to try and help our kids to understand the world around them better? Because I see the seeds of both in what we're discussing, and I get very confused. I'm pretty much in favor of understanding the world better, and then to a certain extent letting the chips fall where they may, because on the whole, if you understand the world better, you understand each other better, and you make bigger allowances for each other once you know those things. But if you have always an intention to try and alter people's consciousness about things as a result of, you know, and the way in which their attitudes and their ideological attitudes towards things within the education system, that is, I think, a road to trouble and so on. But those are just my kind of initial and ignorant musings on what I've heard so far.
Thank you, David. I mean, it's brilliant to have you in journalism, but you've missed your vocation in the classroom, I think, as well in a parallel life. But it's very good innovation, I think, to have the panelists ask the questions as well. And so I'm going to put David's question to the rest of the panel. Samir, I'll come to you on this. What is the relationship, maybe across the curriculum as well as in one subject, between understanding history well and other projects of identity and citizenship and inclusion that schools are engaged in?
Yeah, David raises some of the points and problems that I did contend with, and the Commission also contended with as well. Just to pick up what's the point of this, David's question, I probably add an extra there, David. I think it's probably helping kids understand their position, their role in the country, and their arrival in the country, as well as understanding where Britain fits into the world. There's a couple of interlocking levels there. But I definitely don't think it's about, sort of reprogramming in a national loving, because, you can't control how people take the information you give them. Someone could learn about this and be quite put out by the circumstances of their arrival and where Britain fits into the world. We're not there to tell them that's the wrong reaction to it. We're just there to give them those basic understanding. A couple of things about which subject you do this in. So we're talking about history. And we know that the history curriculum is a battleground that, I suppose, metaphorically is like a World War I battleground that's sort of littered with many corpses of failed attempts at trying to push it in one direction or the other. And Michael Gove, in fact, wrote quite an interesting piece quite a few years ago where he says, I don't know that there are Whig and sort of Marxist factions in other subjects that mobilize on the op-ed pages when you try to move the chemistry curriculum forward. History is quite particular because of all of the things that make history so wonderful and so difficult to pin down. So which other subjects could you do it in? Well, I think David's right. Key stage 3 is the point at which anyone who absolutely hates history, endures it until then they pull the ejector seat and get out. History was my subject, of course. That's why I went on to do what I did. But many people didn't. And how do you reach them? Because otherwise, if you're just talking up to key stage 3, that's a very small number of classroom hours and a very small sort of surface area on the textbooks to actually diffuse this information. I won't go into massive detail on this, but we maybe want to talk about the OAK curriculum a bit later on. OAK being all that online material that many parents who are watching this will know their schools relied on during the pandemic. But certainly when I was reviewing some OAK curriculum sort of lessons helping out the Commission, I certainly noticed there are some very good isolated examples of teaching local history. Not necessarily in history, but maybe on some kind of citizenship kind of module or subject. Fantastic example from Liverpool I found, where just exactly as David is saying, sometimes immigration patterns are so local. And when I learned about the history of East London, where I was born, from before I was born in the 80s, of course, so many British Jews arrived in as did so many migrants before they then went to other parts of London. I didn't know that. It's actually I'd love to have known that fact, to know that my family was setting roots actually in soil, metaphorically, that many other immigrant families have set roots in, and new arrival families, and had thrived. But it takes time sometimes for that to take root. But there are other things, and just to round off, I was quite surprised when I was researching my book, actually. I was trying to find out whether we do and systematically teach the British Empire. And we don't systematically. That's the problem. That individual schools and teachers can take up those modules, but many, of course, don't teach a subject they're not so familiar with. I found in edXL's Geography GCSE, for example, a discussion about global inequality and colonialism, and how India was a colony and how it became independent and how this has affected its economic development in geography. Very interesting. So all over, there are other subjects sort of littered. There are traces. You can't get away from Empire and British Empire. It affects so many things. I don't think it's about pulling it all together and harmonizing it. I think it's just time for a bit of a stock take to make sure these lessons are getting through to children, whether through literature, whether through geography, whether through local history, whether through some sort of citizenship sort of modern lesson, as well as history itself.
Thanks. And it's another thing that I think has become one of these contested arguments. Is this missing? Is that an outdated story because it's there all the time? And actually, a lot of the truth of it is that we don't really know what is actually taught. We know what can be chosen from, but we don't necessarily have that granularity about which choices being made and why. Maggie, it'd be good to bring you back in to respond to what you've been hearing, but also maybe to take on this question of what we're trying to achieve and how do we share the burden, I suppose, of the identity, inclusion, citizenship work we're asking schools to do across a range of subjects.
Yes. So I think, as Samir was just saying, that range of subjects is important. If we just say it's history and we leave it in history, then as you say, we don't get the we don't get the feedback. We can't get it out there enough. So I do think it needs to be part of other subjects, and I think other topics, as I mentioned, are dealt with that way, and it is David mentioned sort of indoctrination, and I know it was the sort of, actually, sorry, David, it's quite interesting because I went to La Saint Union Convent School, which is just down the road from William Ellis, and so which is a Catholic convent school. So I'm looking back at my history now to try and work out what I was taught. But I think that history, unlike science, is very nuanced, and different people have different viewpoints, and that's what makes it challenging. But that's why on the commission we want people to come together and work out, as Samir was saying, the key facts that we can get out there, the key facts that are almost uncontestable. But what I'd like is that kids can find out these key facts and then draw their own conclusions. I don't want it to be indoctrination. I want them to come up with their own ideas. Just as in science, we present sort of information, we present theories, and then people sort of work out, what the theories mean, or sort of find out evidence, or go and do more research to understand it better. So I think that is the key. Basically, I think I've agreed with virtually everything that everybody said in terms of a sort of nuance. I think the idea of just having sort of the good bits of history and forgetting the bad bits of history is criminal, because we need to have the full picture so people can understand their heritage. At the St Union Convent School, I would have loved to find out sort of more about sort of the influx of people to the UK. For quite a bit of my schooling, when I was young, I felt like sort of the outsider. You don't come from around here. If I'd known that there was sort of a history going back 2,000, 3,000 years of people coming to the UK, I would have felt much more included, and I think the people teasing me would have felt that I was more included. So I think this is why it's important, not a matter of indoctrination, not a matter of telling one story, but a matter of telling sort of a range of stories so that people can understand our history in its fullest. So yes, I think in terms of a debate, I think there's quite a bit of overlap in what we're saying, but I'll be interested to see how we progress, and perhaps at the edges where the frays are.
Yes, but a vote there for David's point. I think that the overarching theme of migration is perhaps a strand that can link these different episodes. I mean, as we move from a sort of Commonwealth migration story to a hyperdiversity, sort of recognizing and reflecting every single group in all of the schools is rather difficult. Maybe we need some broader themes. And there is, I think, Patrick, always been a question of whether this is sort of Black history for diverse classrooms or whether this is diverse history for all of the classrooms. And has thinking shifted on that, do you think, over the years and decades we've been doing things like Black History Month?
I mean, when Black History Month was first established in the late 80s, it was about trying to, and it modelled on African American History Month, and it was about making sure that particular, and there was a reason why it's in October, it was about starting the new academic year, and the idea was about trying to give a sense of pride and history, cultural esteem, not just for Black children, but all children to understand that. Obviously, we've built on that because as a result of Black History Month, we've had LGBT History Month, and now we've got the launch of Southeast Asia History Month. And the reason why we're having these history months is because the mainstream history is all about dead white men, basically, in a nutshell. And so that's why everyone's saying, well, why aren't you recognising my history from an LGBT perspective, or from a Black perspective, or Southeast Asian perspective? And that's, I think the curriculum's got a role to play in that. One of the challenges, I think, as we know around the curriculum, is that everyone can opt in, opt out. So, academies don't need to follow the national curriculum, or any history, geography, literature, whatever it is. If you're in private education, you might adopt whatever. So even though we're having this big battle, people are still self-selecting what they're going to do. And even with teachers, I've been to quite a few schools around the country, and it depends how good your head teacher is, and how good your head of year and how your teachers are in terms of what they want to have that inclusive curriculum, basically. So there's kind of more work in that. I mean, but I think one of the key questions about, going back to what David talked about, indoctrination. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with indoctrination. It's going to be the right indoctrination, unquote. So the classic example I have to give you is Windrush. Wendy Williams, who did the Lessons Learned review on the Windrush scandal, one of her recommendations was the teaching of the Commonwealth migration history to the Home Office staff and officials. and even government ministers, I have to emphasise, because they didn't know the history. So just imagine government policy is determined you're not British, but you are British in the first place. But they don't know that because they don't know the history. So to me, if we want to make sure that we have a curriculum, that we have future decision makers in power, they know the history, they know the context, so they can make the right decisions, because those decisions could have disastrous impacts on a whole range of communities as well. And yes, we are moving to a hyper-diversity Britain, but it's always been there. I mean, let's go back 1,000 years, Roman times, that was diverse. They were fighting the Celts, and they were diverse too. And so this kind of impression that we have that British history is about a particular set of people of colour, but British history has always been diverse, but people don't know about it yet. And we have to remind people about that history. It's always been diverse, it's not going to change. It's almost like we're still in this myopic view that history is crossed between Brideshead Revisited and EastEnders. And it's more than that. I'm not joking. That's the way it's been taught. That's what it comes to. If you go to America or any part of Europe, they see Britain in those eyes, in those lenses. So let's make sure that we have a curriculum that is modern, that is diverse, it's reflective, not as opposed to giving this old colonial backdrop.
Thanks, Patrick. Samir, I'll bring you in a second. Just a question to put to you all. Vote for Schools is a great organisation that holds debates every week in lots of schools, about 800 schools. So when they asked this question, they had 30,000 children take part in debating a question in primary and secondary schools. And the question was, do you feel represented by the curriculum? It was quite an even split in primary schools. Quite a tricky question, you might think, in primary schools. In secondary schools, it was quite decisively 3-1 no. And so the question is, should we start by asking the students what do they think, and how, in a practical way, could you use that input as to what might change that? Samir.
Thanks. Just a couple of quick points. Firstly, Patrick, I completely agree with you that sometimes the perceptions from outside of the UK as to who is an Englishman or an Englishwoman are actually quite at odds with the way that our population has evolved. And I've had the benefit of a fairly international career, and sometimes people just don't believe I'm British. And it's not because they're being nasty. It's sometimes the stereotypes on the TV that we export that reinforces that. One point, Sunder, about the hyperdiversity. I mean, yeah, Patrick's right. It's always been a mixture, but just taking the mixture we have now, and just pause for a moment on EU facilitated movement of people, which of course since 2004 and 2007, when the European Union enlarged to take in many new member states in Eastern Europe, it's as part of my career outside of writing, I spent a year working in Ukraine, of all places, which is not part of the EU, but I spent time living and working with Eastern Europeans, including many Polish people are there. And the empire that fell that matters to them is the USSR. And I say that because it's always important to remind ourselves that the British Empire is hugely and unavoidably consequential for immigration patterns into the United Kingdom, but it is not the only one in terms of empires that have risen and fallen. And I sort of reflected quite hard on, I'm not saying we now teach the USSR, I barely have enough time to teach, British history, although I did learn quite a lot about the Russian Revolution, but I did history to A-level, so I had more time. The one thing I would say is that when we teach the Roman Empire, and this can be very foundational, I mean, I'm sure David might have some more recent experiences from his own kids he can feed back, but I still think this is part of something that's quite elemental and very young for children. You're already being exposed to the idea that empires come and go, empires go through waves, they have consequences that cascade down through the generations and influence that cascades down through the generations. We don't need to again tie all this together, but I think it's worth thinking in totality as to how we present this theme about the amount of time that elapses from historical experiences, because ultimately the world and Italy, if we think about the forebears, they're not as directly influenced by the end of the Roman Empire as Britain is by the end of the British Empire, and Eastern Europe and many parts of the world are by the end of the USSR, simply because of proximity to those actual events. And that's such an elemental point, but I'm shocked as to how quickly it gets lost, because of course anyone who wants to say the British Empire shouldn't be criticized immediately says, well, should we go blame the Romans? I'm like, that's the most inane thing you can possibly say. No one alive could directly trace their suffering to the Roman Empire unless they've had 2,000 years. So yeah, just another point, but it comes up time and time again, and it really cheeses me off, that one.
Yes, and another question that's been put by Zara Zaidi is this inclusion, which sounds brilliant, and clearly we need to do it in the society we are. It can also be divisive because it is received as a taking away of these authors or this history, and so on. So that is one of the challenges here. But I'm very struck by what Samir says there about European migration. David, it'd be good to hear your views on this. It feels like to some extent we're catching up with what happened in the second half of the last century. I had to work out, if your parents are Indian and Irish, what sort of British person does that make you? But 1 million Polish-born people in our country and their kids, maybe there's a 30-year rule in history or something, but we're not sort of starting a debate about what that means yet.
No, and that's almost precisely why I said that we should frame this in a very large part of our discussion about history in terms of migration and so on, how peoples come to be and how they come to be where they are and how they came to be here, or and so on, is a very important part of that. And what Samir was saying about how you can also localize it so you can create it, because it is funny really that Samir's parents, if it was a parent, almost certainly lived very close to where my dad was born and where my grandparents first arrived in London off Cable Street on all that time ago. I was just going to say, yesterday I went to a Polish restaurant. At the Polish restaurant, which is in the Polish Club in Exhibition Road in London, which is kind of centre for not Polish nationalism, but certainly for kind of Polish pride. When one of us got a mint tea, it was served in a holder that had the hammer and sickle on it and Misha the Bear from the 1980 Olympics. Now, of course, I was the only person from our kind of family who recognised all that, actually, as it happens, because of a combination of interest. But I said to the guy who was serving us, I said, this is really kind of rather unusual. I hadn't expected to find this. And he said, I'm not Polish, he said. He must have been in his kind of early 30s. I'm Hungarian. But I can tell you that this stuff was washing all around all our countries at the time of the Olympics. This stuff, he said, did you know? He said it was made in Latvia and so on. And we all had it. And that's part of our history. Here he is serving me in a London restaurant and so on. Probably, I imagine, if he's staying in Britain, his kids will also be brought up and be educated in a London school with that bit of history up behind them. So Samir's absolutely right to say that one of the things that you've got to try and get over is the mutability of things and and how people move and why and how they stay and why they do and what they do and how this involves the Polish group in Britain in the next 30 years is going to be really important. I mean, I remember thinking at the times when the Express were running their kind of great big campaign against all these people coming from the EU, I thought, what are you going to say when one of our, biggest Nobel Prize winners in 25 years' time has a Polish surname and gives you, like the Turkish people who were responsible for the partially responsible for what we now call the Pfizer, but which was actually the BioNTech vaccine. Remember that all of a sudden becomes a story that you want to tell, and so it is certainly true that if you teach A, you can't teach the thing that you were teaching before you taught A, because something has to go. And so on. So how you do this is really difficult, and it's always subject to loss aversion. People will say we're losing this, we're losing a bit of Shakespeare here, or we're losing something that we've kind of valued. I went to the Alison when I was actually next to the Polish restaurant in the V&A, the Victorian Albert, big exhibition on Alice in Wonderland. Again, most of the people around me had no idea about Alice in Wonderland. It's gone out of major culture within about the last 20 to 25 years. It's really extraordinary. I had to kind of explain it around the place. I felt like sodding Methuselah, which is a way in which I often do kind of feel, despite the fact these things are not are in our kind of recent past. And that's the other problem we have, which is that things are changing with a degree of rapidity. The world that I was brought up into, the world that women were expected to to be in the world of what we now call diversity, but which is just simply means there are many, many more people from all kinds of different backgrounds, and allowing in for Patrick's point about how it was that you got Batavians patrolling the Hadrian's Wall, etc., and people and African auxiliaries and so on. That's absolutely true, and that is really kind of fascinating, because it's a really good place to start the discussion about migration and movement and empire and so on, which means you can kind of over theme, etc. This does not have to be a situation of conflict between you've got to apologize for this and you've got to kind of warts and all, etc. I don't think that's the point, really. And I don't think that's the point. I think how we got here and who we are, and the various ways in which that came to be is such a big theme for Britain. I mean, after all, this government bangs on about global Britain and so on, and if that's not the meaning of global Britain, i.e. who we are, then I don't know what is.
That's the question. It's
link there to the themes. Patrick, go ahead.
Yeah, because I think Britain goes through a crisis of schizophrenia every 20 years. We try and find out what is British. Gordon Brown tried to redefine what's. Each prime minister, from Tony Blair, tried to use Britpop to redefine what is Britishness. That didn't work out with Blur. I'm not a Blur fan anyway. That's not a story. More funk and disco. Anyway, that's another thing on reggae. But and then Gordon Brown tried to do the same thing. Cameron tried to do the same thing. Theresa May tried to do the same thing, and Boris did the same. And the reason why it becomes contested is politicians trying to assert their worldview, which we don't agree with necessarily. And that's why we're in this culture war. And why we're in this culture war, going back to the report again, the reason why the report was commissioned by Boris Johnson and appointed Tony Sewell and Maggie and others was to look at, in the context of Black Lives Matter, global movement on the murder of George Floyd, and look at our own issues of discrimination in Britain. Yeah, and it's just a point that the report did not actually name it, and say there is issues of historical racism from the history of Britain has influenced structural racism. Let's talk about history. So in a place where I live in Hackney, we have a museum called the Museum of the Home. And they went for a public consultation, like we'll do, and the public of Hackney said, we don't want the statue of Robert Jeffrey, who was a slave trader. But yet the government has threatened the museum, if you remove that statue, we'll cut your funding. Where is the conversations around this when we've actually gone through a process? So it feels like it's suitable for politicians to select when there's a war or not a war, basically. And when we go through a process, we're told actually we will ignore that, we'll bypass that process completely. And part of the problem that we have is if there wasn't this, if we didn't have Black Lives Matter and we didn't have the murder of George Floyd and the report was commissioned, would the conversation be the same or different? That's the question.
Thanks, Patrick, for that question. And the comments and questions are also pouring in from the audience. A very lively discussion going on in the Q&A, and I'll try and find some of the questions that are in there. And Maggie, I'd bring you in on Patrick's question to you, which is to what extent did the Black Lives Matter movement and protests here change this report? But I'd like to link it just to one other thing that's been asked. Raj Unsworth has asked a number of questions. I'm going to link a couple of them together, saying that these are important themes, getting inclusive curriculum right for diversity, but also asks, does the fact that many people in education disagree with the Sewell Commission, does that need to be acknowledged in order to make progress on the policy agenda that goes forward? And a different point being asked as well is, since many of the schools are academies and don't follow the national curriculum, what sort of barrier does that place? So Maggie, if you come in on some of those points, that would be great.
So first of all, I wanted to go back to your question about asking the students, the poll you did. And I find that fascinating because we are trying to sort of present information to these students. I'm a science communicator. I think in the last 14 years, I've seen 300,000 students across the UK and some abroad, and sort of presenting science in certain ways and trying to engage kids with science. But it's always good to get feedback from the people you are speaking to. And so the fact that I think you said sort of a 2 out of 3 felt that the curriculum wasn't engaging for them. It'd be nice to explore that further. Why do they feel that? What's driving that? By Patrick's point, and I think a point that's been made, I don't think the curriculum that we're discussing should be in the hands of politicians. Politicians, if excuse me, come and go. But I think we need something more stable than that. So I don't think this should be done by politicians. And that's one of the reasons where we were saying, although it's through the Department of Education, we want a group of independent experts to be sort of participating in this and working out. But also it has to be alive. As we're saying, it's sort of looking at the story of migration, things are changing all the time. So let's sort of take that on board and make it sort of a living, sort of breathing, dynamic thing, rather than sort of okay, this is how it is at the moment and we'll keep this for the next 50 years. But as to Patrick's point, as to the death of Floyd in America, would that have changed, if that hadn't have happened, would that have changed the outcome of the, I think the recommendations would have probably been similar because of the methodology we used, but the whole thing was triggered by that catastrophic event in the States. And I must admit, that sort of triggered me. I saw young people standing up and saying, this isn't right. And I thought, what am I doing? And I felt I needed to sort of participate and try and make a difference, try and do something about it. So I think the whole thing was triggered. So without that, we wouldn't be here. But at the same time, I don't know what influence it would have had, because by looking at the data and by trying to work out where the disparities are, I think that process would have been very similar. So I'm trying to bring in different threads at the same time. I think that probably covers me for now, but I might chip in again later.
Thanks. I'm gonna put a different question. Samir, you might pick this one up. Mohammed Ibrahim Ali says, when we're talking about teaching modern Britain, how is the ongoing backlash against the teaching of critical race theory? He says it's being characterized as, quote, teaching white people to hate themselves and their history. Is that a problem, going to be a problem for trying to discuss the colonial legacy and so on? And can we avoid it being so?
It's an important question because it's really picked up controversy almost beyond its originators, wildest dreams, I think, in terms of critical race theory. I think the first thing I'd say is, well, children will have never heard of it because they're children and they've got much more interesting and fun things to do when they're 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 than listen to any academic theory that's quite convoluted. And I'm not saying that to knock academic theories or critical race theory. I don't think we should treat children as a blank canvas in terms of painting pictures on a blank canvas in their minds. They all have an inheritance from their household, maybe that cascades down through the generations as well. And I also do believe that there can be things like hurt and pain that cascades through generations, through trauma from previous experience. I think that is all potentially very real, even if it's just your parents are very stressed or raise you in circumstances defined by privation, that can impact a child. So, those are important things to bear in mind. But I think what the critical race theory debate will do, because it's so poisonous, is it will poison how any reform of the curriculum is interpreted, because it might be, one of the points at which people evaluate for and against. That's actually a difficulty, I think, of policy. And it's a difficulty, as with all areas of contentious policy, of managing its reception by the public, through the mill of the op-eds and through the Twitterati. These things are all incredibly difficult. And, to give the Race Commission's report, a bit of breathing space, I thought that, it was going to land in controversy regardless of what it said. And, now we're thinking about reforms and implementing some of its recommendations. I think, for government, I was a former civil servant at the start of my career, and I certainly, and that was in 2009, I joined and spent 6 years. And even between then and now, smartphones, ubiquity of, streamed content is so much more prevalent than it was even in 2009. Government is, with all respect in the world, is never going to be at the forefront of tech innovation. It's always going to be responding to those trends. And there is something about how you land this sort of reform in a way that doesn't immediately whip up a firestorm. I don't know if there's an answer to that, but that is an art in government comms that is the art that is still being learned. And it's going to be tested. And going back to the questioner's point, critical race theory would be one of the points that people use to say, well, it doesn't do this, it does do this, and I'm therefore very offended. Can't hedge against it totally, but we can certainly be aware it would be something that parents and op-ed writers will leap on.
We have a different contribution about critical race theory from Adrian Hart, who, Patrick, disagrees with you about this topic and disagreed with your characterization of Kemi Badenoch's speech, which I think Adrian was sympathetic to the minister's speech, because from his perspective, the problem with critical race theory is that it embeds a concept of racism as permanently embedded within a system of white supremacy as fact, and that is problematic. So Adrian is speaking as a parent and citizen of Brighton who is challenging the council's, he sees, critical race theory based nursery to A-level training now underway in its schools. So you see there that there'll be different people active on different sides of these debates about what the principles and the philosophies are. Did you want to come back on that, Patrick?
Yeah, we're not trying to say that we're going to indoctrinate 8-year-olds in critical race theory. That's not the idea. The idea, critical race theory, is in the academic world, and it's just a way of understanding the world. But one of the key elements of critical race theory is that there's issues of structural racism. Yeah, that's at the heart of it. And the question is, if you're a teacher and you want to educate about the history of empire and modern Britain, you've got to talk about history of racism. It's unavoidable. That is the problem that we have in this country. We shy away from that. I mean, if we had plantations in London, in Somerset, and in Cornwall, and in Northumberland, our conversations on race would be much different than we have now. But because it all happens offshore, in the Caribbean, what's happened in South America, what's happened in Africa, and then if you look at the history of India, it happened over there. So therefore, we don't need to. We can keep that distance from it. But that is part of Britain. So we can't just have that's why I say we need to learn about the good, the bad, and the ugly. I mean, the other thing, just to add around the whole stuff is, I mean, with critical race theory, I'm not trying to say I use critical race theory, but one of the reasons why critical race theory has existed is critiquing our world and critiquing our society. So if we don't have critical race theory, let's drop it. What do we have? We still have a system based on a degree of supremacy, that if you are of a particular class, you have influence, you have power. How do we critique that then? What analysis do you want to use, basically? Because that shapes us. And if we want to have a modern Britain, which is based on one there, which the report talked about, that we want to have a modern Britain, that if you work hard, keep your head down, you'll be successful, that'd be fantastic. But that does not exist. As you can see from what's happened recently with this government, I mean, you know, I sit on boards of NHS organisations. We follow the Nolan principles. We talk about good governance. That, to me, that's even more important, talking about good governance to young people than what all the shenanigans that's been going on. So and that's probably the reason why there's a degree of cynicism when how genuine is this conversation about changing the curriculum when politicians don't practice what they preach.
Thanks, Patrick. David, to bring you in on this, I mean, as a non-academic who's been involved in sort of, race and identity policy debates for about 25 years, I'd heard very little about critical race theory until a year or two ago, really, although, there's a lot of other approaches to race. Is this polarization around these kinds of concepts something we've got to live with, or something we can get beyond?
Well, I've got to be honest, when Patrick was outlining what he was thinking about it there, my mind was taken back to, I mean, I mentioned earlier what was called the Whig theory of history, which, if you like, is an unideologicized version of an ideological approach to history. In other words, you don't call it an ideological, you don't call it an approach to history, but nevertheless it is one, which is essentially a kind of notion of, embedded notion of progress through civilization stages up to the fabulous point which we hold now, and so on. So the Whig theory of history is a very kind of common one. But what he was describing, I thought, sounded exactly like a description of a Marxist theory of history. Almost exactly. You would say, I mean, you could kind of map it on and just change some of the key words, which was that all history is the history of the exploitation of one set of people by another set of people, as defined by a set of labor relationships, etc., which give rise to economic conditions. But then you might then add, because Marx did a kind of, and then creates the circumstances under which they are transformed by one sort of revolution or another. I am not a fan. Now in my latter, I was a big fan of that when I was 18 and so on, but I'm not a big fan of these supervening theories. I'm certainly not a big fan of us basing educational approaches to on the assumption that they're correct. I think that is really problematic, because in 5 to 10 years' time, we'll find out another one. I also never quite understand where, for example, Jews are supposed to fit into this. You know, as I said, they were the first group of people actually completely expelled from England. But they don't fit into kind of people's notions of what these are. I'm not complaining about it. I don't want to be fit into it particularly, or my forebears to be fit into it, and so on. And which is why I kind of, and incidentally, while we're talking about this, we've tended to concentrate on history as the element in the curriculum. We've had one mention for geography and so on. There are huge attempts being made in bits of the kind of English curriculum, and to a certain extent some parts of the geography curriculum, to get people to think more widely than was for a long time the case about what curriculum is. Now, I was also just thinking about, and I don't like, and Samir is absolutely right. Most kids and no teachers don't have any time for something called critical race theory any more than they did for Marxist theory and so on, because you actually have to get on with the business of talking about the world in relatively straightforward terms if you possibly can. But I was very interested in what you said, you know, do you feel represented by the curriculum, the question you ask kids. And I thought, wow, imagine we'd been asked that. I'm just thinking, had you come to our class in William Ellis School circa 1969 and you said, do you feel represented in the curriculum? We wouldn't have known what you were talking about. What do you mean? How am I feeling represented in maths, etc., etc.? Then you could have pointed out to me, well, isn't much kind of discussion about how you got to be here and your family got to be here. And I said, no, I suppose there isn't really. Now you kind of come to mention it. Actually, there's none at all, and so on. So the very fact that you're asking the questions shows the degree to which we are talking about. Now, the big, which is good, but part of the problem is, it is not just about making people who haven't felt included. One of the things that we've discovered is that large numbers of people, whatever their race, whatever their situations, either don't feel included or spoken to, or and so on. So that's why I would rather than kind of frame it in terms of the very particular things. We can come to the particular things; they are important in learning and so on. We should frame it in a much more general way and so on. Now, if that places me with the very unpopular commission to a certain extent, for that moment, I'm prepared to be there, I think.
And I would like to Maggie back
then so would you agree then that slavery was a good thing for Black people then? That's what the commission's basically said.
What would
sorry,
I say?
No, sorry. I have to
Maggie,
take on.
Come in on that.
Yeah, sorry. Why? We didn't say that. No one would say that. So how did you, from what was written, how did you get to there?
Slavery was a character building experience. That's what the commission's report said. What do you mean by character building? I mean, you know,
so,
I'm
okay,
David.
okay, so can I respond?
Sure.
Okay, we're getting to the frayed bits. Yes. Okay.
Let's go for it. Come on. We've been too nice now for the last hour. Come on.
I know. This is good.
Listening.
So this was written in the foreword, and I think what was being said was that despite the inhumanity, the cruel, horrible situation that many people were in, they were able to build their cultures and sort of survive that horrible situation. But the idea that slavery was good for Black people is ridiculous. But I think Do you really believe that, or is it just a good tagline?
I mean, I know that Tony later on gave some more, added more to that. But at the time, when you read the report, that's what he said, and that's why he got heavily criticised. And you know, and on top of that, and this taps into the curriculum, because I mean, going back to David's point, I'm not giving you a Marxist perspective of how history should be taught in Britain. Far from it, actually. But what I'm saying is, if we're talking about the facts, let's talk about the facts. It's on my mind when it comes to certain communities' experiences. We don't want to talk about the facts because either you're too emotional or we haven't got the evidence base. But when evidence is presented, it's not valid or recognised, and that's part of the challenge. And that's why history becomes actually, literature is the same thing as well. Actually, it becomes a hot topic. I mean, even now, there's been lots of publishers are now trying to publish more books, trying to encourage more stuff to be in national curriculum and literature. And there's a similar kickback also around literature as well as history. And we need to explore what the kickback is. Is a kickback a genuine one, either because it's made up, or is a kickback is actually we're not ready to learn our truth, to learn our history? And I think that's really, really important.
So based on the commission and the idea of this sort of the making of modern Britain, we want the facts. We want, as Samir said, sort of the key basic points of sort of migration, of movement, but as the good and the bad. So, but the problem is, how do we get there? And the playing field is very polarized. It is very emotive, and it has to be emotive. Race is emotive, but at the same time, we have to transcend that. And one of my disappointments about the report is that people sort of homed in on sort of one or two lines. This is one of the recommendations, the making of modern Britain. This could make a difference to many people, to generations to come. So can't we tackle that and find a way to transcend the politics, to transcend the polarization?
I'm all for transcending, Maggie. You know something? I work with a whole cross section of organisations and people where we find a common agenda. Yes. And transcending is really, really critical.
Yes.
But at the same time, people can't be gaslighted at the same time while transcending. It doesn't work.
Maggie, I'd like to just to put a question to you, because I think we've hit on something really important here in this section of the debate. There is, and in the deliberative research we did, in the attitudes research, actually, if we get to what should we teach in classrooms, there's the potential really for a really broad consensus on the kinds of approaches we've heard today. And then there is the question of whether these kinds of ideological and philosophical debates, critical race theory as much as left politics or right politics, whether getting that right or wrong is critical. And I just wonder how do we insulate now this practical agenda from that ideological debate, and how much did the commission itself debate that issue about philosophy, or the role of race politics in America today, and what was right or wrong about that versus this kind of practical agenda?
Yes, so we did definitely focus on the practical agenda, and I think our viewpoint was sort of to have a curriculum that gives sort of the key basic facts of sort of the history of the UK, the migration, the what's happened in the UK, but then leave it open-ended so kids can engage with it and then go and find out for themselves. I don't want to spoon-feed them theories. The theories are out there. There are many different theories out there. But if we can give them the facts, then they can work out what theory effectively works for them. But so I don't think the theories or the different those different things should come into that. It's just as Samir was saying, get sort of the basics, give them those, the good and the bad. I don't think we should sort of whitewash it or do anything like that. Give them the good and the bad and let them come and draw their own conclusions and find out more if they want to. So it's sort of opening up rather than closing down.
And while we were debating that, I'll come to you, Samir. Adrian Hart came in from the audience again, Patrick, with a bit of challenge and a bit of an olive branch, which was to say comparative teaching of different ideas is fine, more than fine, necessary, but you can't teach theories as fact. And so that's one of the ways to characterize the debate as he sees it. Samir.
Just a very quick comment on critical race theory to round that one off. I also had no time, despite doing history till A level, to learn even about Marxism, despite learning about the Russian Revolution. We couldn't divert the lesson to study the ideology in the school with the amount of time we had. Ditto when I studied the Nazis, we did a little bit about what fascism is, but I had to wait till university till I actually understood about fascism's relationship to nationalism. That's really from sort of a bit later on. So there probably isn't the time, I think, to even contemplate having it in schools. I want to make a slightly different point because, of course, the difficulty with this issue around how we teach history, and in particular the British Empire history, is it becomes very self-referential around Britain's own hang-ups with itself. Now, that's part of the reality, that's fine. Just let's cast our minds forward. If you've got children in the audience and you know that their lifespan is going to take them to the 2070s, the 2080s, thinking about how long they'll live, think about the changing world that they will be Britons in. Think about the drift of a lot of global wealth and power and demographic power, if nothing else, to China, to India. Think about the difficult relationships that Britain has had through, whether it's the Opium War, whether it's through partition, of course, the Raj, and building on the Mughal Empire. These are huge issues. They're actually, I think they might have been hobby horse pursuits for a certain period of time. And they actually might become quite sort of front and center to a lot of young people when they're looking at where they're going to work, when they're looking at who they're competing with for jobs, when they maybe start to run a tech company and look where the competition is coming from. Governments know this. That's one of the reasons why these issues now dominate headlines. They're not about schools, but we are also training our future workforce and our citizens of the world. And I sort of boil it down in the following way, because I think I really, really feel I'm not torn that the empire's got good and bad. I feel like I'm a living embodiment of the good and bad, in the sense of the things that the British Empire achieved and was bequeathed and all the rest of it. If I erase the British Empire, Sunder, I loved your review of a book that I saw. I don't want to de-invent my own existence here. So there's something of a sort of a love-hate relationship with the British Empire, but I know my parents didn't like it very much because they complained about it a lot when I was growing up. But that's their experiences. But when I think about where we're going to be heading in the future, I really want to equip Britons and our population with the sort of the skills and the ability to understand that for all of its faults, Britain does sit at the center of some very influential global networks. Hopefully they'll have great opportunities to work and study abroad, or very simply to interact with people from all around the world. And some of the terms of that are the outcomes of historical experiences, good and bad, from many different parts of the world. It's awfully complicated, but I suspect the world that they're going to be sort of navigating is going to be quite a complicated one, and a very different one to the 20th century, early 21st century.
But let's hope that we do better in the Eurovision Song Contest, because if you look at the scoring in the Eurovision Song Contest, we're always bottom all the time because everyone hates us because of our arrogance, because we talk about the empire all the time. So I think young people can learn a degree of humility from the past if they want to build this brave new world.
We just need Graham Norton to convene a jury of British Europeans to help us to pick the right song, and we can make progress there even before we fix the history curriculum. Now we've just got 5 minutes to go, and there's some coming down from the clouds of critical race theory and so on. Just I'd like to get some ideas about what you would prioritise for change, and we've got some interesting points and questions that have come in, especially from people who are working in education. There is still a phenomenon, people are saying, of teaching to the test, and that is a barrier perhaps to some of the ambitions we've been talking about today. Catherine Bickerstead says this: having been a teacher for over 20 years in independent and state sectors in England, and recently a head teacher and of mixed heritage herself, she says she's bombarded by diktats from the Department of Education, but rarely gets the support that suggests there's the educational expertise behind that. And there are a number of other contributions about the resources that might be needed to do this well, and how we could make that happen. So I'd like to just hear from each of you as to how we, with all navigating all of these big debates that we're doing, what could we be saying, whether it's to Mr. Gove, whether it's to other practitioners in this debate? How could we be bringing about change? And Patrick, I might start with you on this one.
Yeah, sure. So my advice to Michael Gove, who's going to be in charge of implementing the report. Let's just assume the reports gets implemented, because the majority of race reports done commissioned by any government never gets implemented. So let's see if this one gets implemented. Maggie, you might have to kind of remind Michael Gove about your hard work about that. But you know, we haven't really talked about issues around representation. There's one thing about the curriculum, and obviously we've talked a lot about history, but we're not talking about representation, because there is still in major city areas hardly enough, particularly Black and Asian people in senior roles in teaching, either as head teachers, head of years, etc. And it's about role modeling. So, and obviously, you know, vast majority of children will have experience of being taught by white teachers. They need to have the confidence and the support to teach an inclusive history. And also it's about increasing the representation of particularly Black staff working in schools as well. And the other bit linked to that is if we can agree to have a political neutral zone on the curriculum, where if you left, right and centre, that would be a result. I don't know how we achieve that, but I think the meddling of education, the funding, as Maggie said, you know, the very fact you have to get your head around the whole funding of schools and the structure of schools, the teaching of schools, the curriculum. We need to work towards have something where we want to create a platform for all children in the future. They have learn a common set, no matter if they're in Manchester or all the way down in Somerset. They learn history, which helps them to be better individuals, to learn from the past, so we could have a better Britain. Surely that's going to be the essence of history. And I think the way that we're doing it right now is not quite doing that, but we need to do more of that. But support for teachers, having a diverse workforce is also critical as well.
So resources, representation, and this effort at depoliticisation. Samir, where would your priorities be?
I'll take it to a sort of a very sort of grassroots level, and I'd say there's quite a lot of responsibility, I'd have thought, on schools and on teachers to understand the basic ancestry of the inhabitants of the classroom. And, you know, I think in many cases, schools and individual teachers do an enormously good job at doing that, because it's so local. And I wonder, you know, if there are good examples of that, having that maybe cascade upwards, because, you know, I've taught at higher education, I've not taught at school level. And certainly as this moves forward in engagement with teachers and those who deliver these services in the front line, I think will be critical, especially in educating, you know, the civil servants and certainly the politicians eventually about the art of the possible, and what can actually work, what doesn't actually work. And whether local variation, not through tokenistic reasons, but local variations are actually quite important, somehow build in as you take forward what I think is actually a really sensibly titled project, Making a Modern Britain, as a great start point in the sort of the basic historical self-awareness and civic education of a child, you know, as they leave, you know, to navigate the country and their lives going into the future.
Thanks. David.
I so much agree with that I'm kind of reluctant really to add very much to it. I mean, it does seem to me that is very much the project. I mean, it's great that we have a new Museum of Migration. It's interesting that we don't have a Museum of Britain. We don't have one. We have a British Museum, but that's not the same thing. And actually, the fact that it's not the same thing tells you quite a lot about the way in which things have developed. I've always thought that the MP should move out of the Parliament, the Houses of Parliament, which are useless for the purposes of running a modern legislature, and turn that into a Museum of Britain, which would have all these elements, a large number of these elements included. I do think that migration, how we got to be who we are, should be a significant part of any historical curriculum, but within key stage 3, because that's what everybody is doing. And as Samir said, you could tailor it for localities and so on, and make your kind of illustration, your illustrations that way. It does seem to me that it is. I mean, the issue of representation is always a kind of rather fraught one, because you can see value in being taught by people who are not quite like you. frankly. And one of the things that worries me about what the Jewish community has done increasingly is it's increasingly sending its children to Jewish schools. And that's a problem, because what it means is that a large section of British people don't come into contact with British Jews and don't know anything about them. And you can see from some of the things that are going on up in Batley and Spen what some of the consequences of that actually can be, because what you have is insufficient information within different sections of the diversity of Britain about other sections of the diversity of Britain. And that is actually a significant threat. It's not one that you easily deal with didactically in schools, except within a very kind of general project of teaching us more about ourselves, and that means factually about ourselves, not with, and we've all said this now, not with the intention to tell you. I mean, I don't think people need to be told that slavery is not great for slaves. I mean, in the sense that you don't need to be told. You might very well want to be told what the conditions of slavery actually were, and so on, and what it meant. In fact, you need to be told that. You absolutely do need to be told that. It's a significant part of ours and other nations' history, which means also that when in the context of dealing with empire, one of the things that people need to think about is not just. And we're talking about people who regard themselves as maybe or would be regarded as the majority. They have to make the imaginative leap of imagining what it's like to be conquered, because that's very difficult, because the British historical sense, and I'm talking outside schools now, is essentially encapsulated in World War II. That's its encapsulation. That's what most people looked at. That was the most common reference point in Brexit and elsewhere, which allows you not to, you don't make the imaginative leap of empire, which is to say, yeah, you could, like, what did the Romans ever do for us? They bought roads, etc. Yeah, but they were the Romans. And they told you where to stick the bleeding roads, and they told you what you had to learn, etc. And that's not easy for people. And people don't like it, and it's not fun in that kind of way. Even if your own domestic rulers are crappier than the ones who were brought in, the fact is that in some sense they were yours. Now, this is a really nuanced point and a difficult point, but it's one which I think you can kind of try and get over to people, and not just in the school setting. And this is the other problem. Why is it that we imagine that somehow or other our kids would not be at all informed by these stupid rows we keep on having that miss the point, and so on? And as a media person, I take a large amount of kind of responsibility for that at one end of it. Why do we imagine that we can somehow or other deal with it? Is it because the schools are the only thing that we actually control? So we kind of focus it all on the schools, not on the parents, they're beyond our command, etc. Not on social media, because who can possibly do anything about that, etc. So if we're serious about these things, we've got to think about how the interventions work in all these kinds of situations, not just in schools.
Thanks, David. And Maggie, I'll give the last word to you. What can we expect to see change, and how can other people, listening to this, get involved in making things change?
I think so a number of teachers have spoken and mentioned resources. I think a number of our recommendations do require resources. So we'll see how that goes down with the government. But I know teachers, I go out to schools sort of regularly to give talks, and I know teachers are in the thick of it, to say the least. And I think the idea of saying, hey, no, you need to do this now. That's why we want something that's robust and easy to implement, and sort of, and the resources that they can implement it. I think there are some things in a core curriculum, and I'd like to sort of start a debate as to whether this sort of subject should be in a core curriculum. The making of modern Britain should be part of, we have maths, we have English, arithmetic, whatever, but should this be part of a core curriculum? Because I think it is important to everyone. Looking at David's sort of comment just at the end there about sort of why focus on schools, I think schools do have the power to reach more than just the kids. As a science communicator, I go out to schools, but often in the evening I might give a sort of a talk to sort of friends and family of the school. So although I think school is the hub of many communities, so it is a good place to tackle things. And I love Samir's idea that it's sort of looking at the local history. That's we can have this core curriculum online, which could be available to everybody, but as well sort of celebrate sort of local heroes, sort of local migration, things like that, because I think that makes it more relevant to kids as well. I love the idea of a Museum of Britain, but again, more resources and also limited capabilities. So I think, yeah, get it out into the schools, because that's a great way of getting it out to the community.
Thanks, Maggie. Thanks everybody for taking part. Final thought from me is that this is potentially a polarized debate where we disagree. It's also potentially a debate where we agree. It's very clear from British Futures research that there is much more consensus across ethnic and class lines and geographic lines among the general public on this theme of what we all want to know about this proud history that none of us know very much about, to be honest, than there is among the politicians and the commentators and the tweeters, for sure. And therefore, if we can get a broader engagement in this debate, there's a much broader middle to unlock, but you need leadership to do that. In educational institutions, you probably do need leadership and voices who want to do that in politics and the media as well. So thanks everybody for participating. It's been a very lively discussion below the line, as well as a good discussion from our panel. Do stay in touch with us. Do tell us what you're doing in this area and how we can stay involved in efforts to take this forward. So I'd just like to say thank you to David, to Maggie, to Patrick, and to Samir for leading this discussion. And thanks everybody for taking part. Thank you.